True Scary Crazy Neighbor Horror Stories 1. The Peeping Tom. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Johnson family had always enjoyed their peaceful life. However, their tranquility was shattered by a new neighbor who had moved into the house next door. At first, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson found him to be friendly enough, but it wasn't long before strange things started happening. Mrs. Johnson began noticing oddities, like her curtains being slightly askew or the sense that she was being watched. One night, while preparing dinner, she caught a glimpse of someone's shadow on the kitchen wall. After a few unsettling nights, she decided to investigate. She discovered that her neighbor had installed cameras pointing directly into her home. Shocked and terrified, Mrs. Johnson reported him to the authorities. It turned out that he had a history of voyeurism and had been using the cameras to spy on several families. The neighbor was arrested, but the Johnsons were left with a lasting fear of their once friendly neighbor. 2. The Unsettling Sounds. The Thompson family loved their rural home, but the peace of the countryside was interrupted by their neighbor, Mr. Baker. Initially, he seemed like a harmless old man, but his peculiar habits quickly grew disturbing. Every night, as soon as the clock struck midnight, the Thompson household would hear strange noises coming from Mr. Baker's property. The sounds were often described as shrill, unnatural, and utterly terrifying. Whispers and eerie murmurs seemed to float through the air. One night, Mrs. Thompson decided to investigate. She crept over to Mr. Baker's house and peered through a crack in his window. What she saw was enough to freeze her blood. Mr. Baker was performing bizarre rituals with what appeared to be a large collection of strange artifacts. The old man was muttering in an unfamiliar language and seemingly communicating with unseen entities. Fearing for her safety, Mrs. Thompson reported the bizarre activities to the police. It was revealed that Mr. Baker had been involved in occult practices for decades, making the peaceful countryside feel far less serene. 3. The Obsession. The Andersons had always been a close-knit family, so when their new neighbor, Mr. Smith, moved in, they made a point of welcoming him. However, Mr. Smith's friendliness quickly turned into obsession. He began appearing at their doorstep unannounced, always with a strange excuse. Initially, the Andersons were accommodating, but Mr. Smith's behavior grew increasingly invasive. He would linger near their home, watching through the windows, and his visits became more frequent. One evening, Mr. Smith showed up with an armful of gifts, claiming they were just because. The gifts were peculiar and unsettling, including items like locked boxes and strange trinkets. When the Andersons tried to confront Mr. Smith, he would become agitated and defensive. They discovered that he had been tracking their daily routines obsessively, even using technology to monitor their movements. After a series of tense confrontations and police involvement, Mr. Smith was eventually removed from the neighborhood. The Andersons were left deeply shaken by their unsettling experience. 4. The Vengeful Neighbor. In a peaceful neighborhood, the Patel family had always maintained a cordial relationship with their neighbors. Everything changed when a new family moved in next door. Mr. and Mrs. Patel were friendly and welcoming, but the new neighbor, Mr. Clark, was not the same. Over time, Mr. Clark began to exhibit increasingly hostile behavior. He would leave menacing notes on the Patels' doorstep and make threats about their property. His hostility escalated into vandalism, with Mr. Clark damaging their lawn and even setting fire to their mailbox. Despite numerous complaints and police reports, Mr. Clark's actions continued. The Patels discovered that Mr. Clark was harboring a grudge against anyone who lived near him due to a previous dispute with former residents. His vengeful attitude and relentless harassment made the Patel family's life a living nightmare. The situation only ended when Mr. Clark was finally evicted for his criminal behavior. 5. The Hidden Room. The Rodriguez family had always loved their home, but when a new neighbor, Mr. Gomes, moved in across the street, things took a dark turn. Mr. Gomes was a reclusive man who rarely interacted with anyone, but his behavior soon became increasingly strange. One day, the Rodriguez family noticed that Mr. Gomez's house was undergoing a lot of construction work. Out of curiosity, they began to investigate. They found that the work was centered around a hidden room in the basement. When they asked Mr. Gomes about it, he became defensive and refused to provide any explanation. The situation grew more alarming when strange sounds started coming from the Gomez house at all hours. Concerned for their safety, the Rodriguez family decided to call the authorities. When the police arrived and investigated the hidden room, they discovered a disturbing setup of soundproofing materials and restraints. It was clear that Mr. Gomes had been preparing a space for sinister activities. Mr. Gomes was taken into custody, but the discovery left the Rodriguez family deeply unsettled. The knowledge that someone so close had such dark intentions was enough to make them question the safety of their neighborhood. 6. The secret passage. The Miller family was thrilled to move into their historic home, full of charm and character. But their excitement soon turned to fear when they discovered something strange about their neighbor, Mr. Harris. He seemed overly interested in their house, frequently asking intrusive questions and peering over their fence. One day, the Millers found a hidden door in their basement that led to a secret passage connecting their home to Mr. Harris' property. The passage had been cleverly concealed behind bookshelves and false walls. When they confronted Mr. Harris, he admitted he had been using the passage to spy on them and rummaged through their belongings. The discovery was horrifying. Mr. Harris had been watching them for months, collecting personal information and invading their privacy. The Millers changed their locks, sealed off the passage, and reported Mr. Harris to the authorities. The incident left them feeling deeply violated and wary of their surroundings. 7. The unsettling portraits. In a small, close-knit community, the Jacksons were excited about their new home. Their neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, was an elderly woman who seemed nice at first. She often came over to offer baked goods and friendly advice. However, things took a turn for the worse when the Jacksons began noticing disturbing changes in Mrs. Wilson's behavior. One day, they discovered that Mrs. Wilson had been painting eerie portraits of their family members, depicting them in unsettling and unnatural ways. The paintings showed exaggerated, grotesque features and dark, haunting scenes. When confronted, Mrs. Wilson claimed the portraits were meant to capture their true essence, but the Jacksons found them deeply disturbing. The situation escalated when the Jacksons found out Mrs. Wilson had been using the portraits to perform strange rituals on their behalf, trying to influence their behavior through her art. Feeling threatened and uncomfortable, they eventually moved out and reported her to local authorities, who advised them to stay vigilant and take their concerns seriously. 8. The stalker. The Davis family moved into a quaint suburban neighborhood hoping for a fresh start. They enjoyed their new life until they encountered their neighbor, Mr. Thompson, a man in his mid-40s with an unnerving fascination with their teenage daughter, Emily. At first, it seemed like Mr. Thompson was simply friendly, but his behavior quickly became obsessive. He would appear at their door unannounced, offer gifts, and make inappropriate comments about Emily. His fixation grew so intense that he started following her around town and showing up at places she frequented. The situation escalated when Emily discovered that Mr. Thompson had installed surveillance cameras around their home to keep track of her. The Davis family reported Mr. Thompson to the police, who conducted a thorough investigation and found evidence of his stalking behavior. Mr. Thompson was charged with harassment and stalking, but the emotional toll on the Davis family was significant. They had to take extensive security measures and ensure their safety, leaving them with a deep sense of distrust toward others. 9. The hidden basement. The Lewis family was ecstatic about their new home, a large, modern house in a thriving neighborhood. However, their excitement turned into fear when they discovered that their neighbor, Mr. Cooper, had a disturbing secret. The Lewis family had noticed odd noises and strange activity coming from Mr. Cooper's house, but thought little of it. One night, they'd heard a loud commotion and saw Mr. Cooper's house lit up with flashing lights. When they investigated, they discovered a hidden basement beneath Mr. Cooper's property, which had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. The basement was filled with disturbing equipment and substances, indicating that Mr. Cooper was involved in illegal and dangerous activities. The Lewis family reported the situation to the authorities, who found evidence of illegal drug manufacturing and other criminal activities. Mr. Cooper was arrested, and the Lewis family was left shaken by the horrifying revelation of what had been happening next door. 10. The intrusive gifts. The Brown family had always enjoyed their quiet suburban life until their new neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, moved in. Mr. Jenkins was overly generous, constantly bringing gifts and offering help. Initially, the Browns appreciated his kindness, but they soon grew uneasy as the gifts became more personal and intrusive. Mr. Jenkins began leaving gifts that were oddly specific to each family member's private interests and habits. He would give their teenage son video games he knew he liked, and their daughter, who was a budding artist, received art supplies that matched her exact preferences. It soon became clear that Mr. Jenkins was using this knowledge to manipulate and control the family. The Browns discovered that Mr. Jenkins had been researching their personal lives in detail, using the information to exert influence over them. His obsessive behavior and the nature of his gifts became increasingly disturbing. They confronted Mr. Jenkins and, feeling unsafe, took measures to protect themselves by changing their routine and reporting his behavior to local authorities. 11. The haunting echo. The Carter family had just moved into a picturesque home on the edge of town, eager to start fresh. Their neighbor, Mrs. Reed, was a reclusive elderly woman who rarely left her home. While her solitude was initially seen as a harmless quirk, the Carters soon found themselves disturbed by inexplicable phenomena. Late at night, the Carters began hearing eerie echoes of their own conversations coming from Mrs. Reed's house. It wasn't just that the sounds were repeated, they were distorted and imbued with a sinister tone. The family's attempts to ignore the noises proved futile as they grew louder and more unsettling. One night, the Carters decided to investigate and discovered that Mrs. Reed's house was filled with old-fashioned recording equipment. She had been recording their conversations for weeks, using the tapes to create her own disturbing echoes. When confronted, Mrs. Reed revealed that she was obsessed with the idea of capturing and controlling the lives of those around her. The Carters quickly moved out and reported Mrs. Reed to the authorities, who confiscated her equipment and ensured she received psychological help. 12. The enigmatic locked room. The Mitchells were excited about their new home, a charming Victorian house with a history. Their neighbor, Mr. Grant, was an eccentric historian with a fascination for old houses. His behavior was peculiar but not initially alarming. However, things took a darker turn when the Mitchells discovered a locked room in their attic. Mr. Grant seemed overly interested in the room, frequently dropping by and making odd comments about its hidden history. When the Mitchells managed to unlock the door, they found a room filled with unsettling artifacts, old medical equipment, and unsettling journals detailing gruesome experiments. The discovery was horrifying. It turned out that Mr. Grant had been using the room for unethical historical research involving disturbing practices. The Mitchells reported their findings to the authorities, leading to Mr. Grant's arrest. The Mitchells were left traumatized by the knowledge that their neighbor had been conducting such macabre activities right next door. 13. The surveillance nightmare. The Kellys had moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, looking forward to a peaceful life. Their neighbor, Mr. Davis, was a retired military officer who took an obsessive interest in neighborhood security. Initially, his focus on safety seemed reasonable, but his methods soon became invasive. Mr. Davis installed multiple security cameras not only around his property but also directed at the Kellys' home. He would frequently comment on the Kellys' daily routines, displaying a disturbing level of detail. When the Kellys confronted him, Mr. Davis insisted that he was simply keeping an eye out for their safety. The situation escalated when the Kellys discovered hidden cameras in their own yard and house. Mr. Davis had been monitoring them around the clock. They contacted the authorities, who found that Mr. Davis had a history of obsessive behavior. The Kellys had to take drastic measures to secure their privacy and protect themselves from further intrusion. 14. The phantom neighbor. The Andersons had just moved into a new home in a serene neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Green, was known for his erratic behavior and mysterious comings and goings. The Andersons were initially wary, but decided to keep their distance and focus on their own lives. Over time, the Andersons began to notice strange occurrences. Objects in their home would be out of place, and they would hear footsteps when no one was there. They even saw a shadowy figure lurking around their property at night. Despite their attempts to confront Mr. Green, he would deny any involvement and act strangely detached. One night, the Andersons installed security cameras and captured footage of Mr. Green entering their home through an unlocked window. He had been living in their attic secretly, using it as a hideout to spy on them. The revelation was terrifying. and the Andersons had to undergo significant security upgrades and counseling to cope with the invasion of their personal space. 15. The midnight rituals. The Young family had recently moved to a quaint countryside home, excited about their new life away from the city. Their neighbor, Ms. Lewis, was a quiet woman who rarely interacted with others. The Youngs began to notice strange lights and sounds coming from Ms. Lewis' property late at night. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. They discovered that Ms. Lewis was conducting bizarre rituals in her backyard. The rituals involved strange symbols, chanting, and eerie ceremonies that took place under the cover of darkness. The Youngs were deeply disturbed by these findings and felt unsafe living so close to someone with such unsettling practices. They reported Ms. Lewis to local authorities, who investigated and found that her rituals were part of a fringe religious practice. Though not illegal, the disturbing nature of the rituals made the Youngs feel deeply uncomfortable. They ultimately decided to move to a different area to regain their sense of security. 16. The unexpected guest. The Foster family was thrilled to have purchased their dream home, but their excitement turned to dread when their new neighbor, Mr. Robinson, began showing up unannounced. Mr. Robinson's visits started innocently enough, but soon his behavior became increasingly intrusive. He would arrive at odd hours, bringing gifts that seemed to be oddly personal, such as family photographs and items from their home. The Foster family soon realized that Mr. Robinson had been entering their house while they were away, helping himself to their belongings, and even rearranging their furniture. The situation escalated when the Fosters discovered hidden cameras in their home installed by Mr. Robinson to monitor their activities. Feeling violated and unsafe, they reported Mr. Robinson to the authorities, who uncovered a pattern of similar behavior with previous neighbors. The Fosters had to take additional security measures and change their daily routines to ensure their safety. 17. The mysterious deliveries. The Parker family was delighted with their new suburban home until they began receiving mysterious deliveries. At first, the items seemed benign: fruit baskets, books, and small trinkets. However, the deliveries quickly grew stranger, with items like disturbing photos and cryptic notes. Their neighbor, Ms. Thompson, seemed overly interested in the deliveries and would often ask about them. The Parkers discovered that Ms. Thompson was behind the strange deliveries, using them to test her theories about human reactions to fear and mystery. When confronted, Ms. Thompson revealed she had been conducting a psychological experiment on her neighbors. The Parkers were horrified by the invasion of their privacy and the manipulation they had endured. They reported her actions to the authorities, and Ms. Thompson was forced to cease her experiments and face legal consequences for her intrusive behavior. 18. The toxic fumes. The Wilsons had just moved into a picturesque home in a friendly neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Adams, was a quiet man who rarely interacted with anyone. However, the Wilsons began to experience mysterious health issues shortly after moving in. They suffered from headaches, dizziness, and nausea that seemed to have no clear cause. As their health problems worsened, the Wilsons decided to investigate. They discovered that Mr. Adams was running an illegal chemical lab in his basement. The lab was emitting toxic fumes that were seeping into their home. The Wilsons had to evacuate immediately and report the situation to the authorities. The investigation revealed that Mr. Adams had been conducting dangerous chemical experiments without proper safety measures. The toxic fumes had been affecting not only the Wilsons but also other neighbors. Mr. Adams was arrested, and the neighborhood had to undergo extensive cleanup to ensure it was safe to live in again. 19. The disturbing sculpture. The Harris family moved into a new home in an art-centric community, excited about the neighborhood's creative vibe. Their neighbor, Ms. Collins, was an artist known for her elaborate and somewhat avant-garde sculptures. Initially, the Harris family admired her work, but their feelings changed when they noticed something peculiar. Ms. Collins's sculptures started to take on disturbing themes, depicting unsettling and grotesque figures. One sculpture, in particular, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Harris family's own faces, with eerie, lifelike details that made them feel deeply uncomfortable. Upon further investigation, the Harris family discovered that Ms. Collins had been using their photographs and personal details to create her disturbing sculptures. She admitted to being obsessed with capturing the essence of her neighbors in her art, but the invasion of their privacy and the unsettling nature of the sculptures left the Harris family feeling disturbed and violated. They reported Ms. Collins's behavior, and she was required to alter her artistic practices to respect her neighbor's privacy. 20. The unwelcome visitor. The Roberts family had recently settled into a quiet rural home, looking forward to a peaceful life away from the city. Their neighbor, Mr. Murphy, was a reclusive man with a reputation for being somewhat eccentric. It wasn't long before the Roberts family began to experience strange occurrences. They would find their doors and windows slightly ajar, even when they were sure they had locked them. One night, they discovered a stranger in their home, a man who turned out to be Mr. Murphy. He had been entering their home through unlocked doors and hiding in various rooms. Mr. Murphy claimed he was merely checking on them because he felt they were in danger, though his behavior was clearly erratic and intrusive. The Roberts family was terrified and reported Mr. Murphy to the authorities. He was found to have a history of similar behavior with other neighbors. The Roberts had to take additional security measures and ensure their home was always locked and secure. 21. The cult. The Jacksons were thrilled to move into a charming old home, but their excitement quickly turned to fear when they met their new neighbor, Ms. Foster. Ms. Foster was quiet and reclusive, but seemed pleasant enough. However, the Jacksons began to notice strange gatherings at Ms. Foster's house, often involving a group of people dressed in odd ritualistic clothing. Their curiosity grew when they discovered that Ms. Foster was leading a secretive cult. The cult conducted bizarre rituals and ceremonies in her backyard, often involving eerie chanting and strange symbols. The Jacksons felt increasingly uncomfortable as they realized the cult's practices were not only strange, but also potentially dangerous. When they reported their concerns to the authorities, an investigation revealed that the cult was involved in illegal activities and had been operating covertly for years. Ms. Foster and her followers were arrested, and the Jacksons were relieved to have their safety restored. 22. The perpetual darkness. The Bennett family enjoyed their new home in a neighborhood known for its bright and welcoming atmosphere. However, their enjoyment was marred by their neighbor, Mr. Jones, who had a peculiar obsession with darkness. Mr. Jones installed blackout curtains over all his windows and would keep his house shrouded in darkness at all times. At first, the Bennett family thought nothing of it, but they soon realized that Mr. Jones's obsession with darkness was more than just a quirky preference. He would use powerful spotlights to create an intense and disturbing contrast between light and shadow in his yard, often shining them directly into the Bennett's home. The disturbing light show became a nightly ordeal, causing stress and sleep disturbances for the Bennett family. They confronted Mr. Jones, who claimed it was a personal ritual but agreed to modify his lighting setup after the situation escalated. The Bennett family had to install additional window coverings and adjust their living conditions to cope with the intrusive light displays. 23. The eerie soundtrack. The Green family had just moved into their new home and were settling in when they began to hear a peculiar repetitive sound coming from their neighbor's house. The sound was a haunting melody played on a loop, always at the same time every night. The Green family tried to ignore it, but the melody became increasingly disturbing. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the fact that it seemed to be accompanied by eerie, unintelligible whispers. They decided to investigate and discovered that their neighbor, Mr. Peterson, was playing the melody as part of a bizarre ritual intended to ward off negative energy. The constant, eerie music and whispers made the Green family's life miserable. They reported the issue to local authorities, who found that Mr. Peterson was using sound as a form of psychological manipulation. He was asked to cease his ritualistic practices, but the Green family had to endure several weeks of discomfort before their peace was restored. 24. The ancestral curse. The Miller family's new home was an old, stately mansion in a historical neighborhood. Their neighbor, Ms. Walker, was a historian with an intense interest in the house's past. At first, the Millers found her knowledge intriguing, but it soon became clear that her fascination went beyond mere history. Ms. Walker revealed that she believed the house was cursed, and she was conducting her own investigations to lift the curse. Her methods were unorthodox and involved disturbing rituals, including seances and the use of old relics that she claimed were tied to the curse. The Millers became increasingly unsettled by Ms. Walker's behavior, especially when she began involving them in her rituals and insisting that they participate to break the curse. The situation became unbearable, and they had to firmly refuse her involvement. They'd also reported her activities to local authorities, who advised her to cease her personal investigations. The Millers had to take extra precautions to ensure their home remained a sanctuary from Ms. Walker's unsettling practices. 25. The hidden cameras. The Wilson family had moved into a new home, happy to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Their neighbor, Mr. Clark, was a seemingly normal man who maintained a polite distance. However, the Wilsons soon started to feel uncomfortable when they noticed strange occurrences around their property. They discovered hidden cameras placed around their yard and even inside their house. Mr. Clark had been secretly monitoring their activities and using the footage to harass them with disturbing messages and threats. The Wilsons were horrified and contacted the authorities, who conducted a thorough investigation and found that Mr. Clark had a history of similar behavior with previous neighbors. He was arrested, and the Wilsons had to make significant changes to their home security to protect their privacy and peace of mind. 26. The unauthorized renovation. The Thompson family was thrilled to move into their new suburban home, but their enthusiasm quickly faded when they discovered their neighbor, Mr. Ellis, was conducting unauthorized renovations on their property. Mr. Ellis, a retired contractor, started by repairing the fence between their yards, but his work soon escalated into more intrusive activities. The Thompson family noticed that Mr. Ellis was making alterations to their home structure, including drilling holes and installing hidden compartments. When confronted, Mr. Ellis claimed he was improving their property and insisted that his actions were for their benefit. However, his renovations were not only unauthorized but also invasive and damaging. The situation became distressing when the Thompsons found hidden cameras and listening devices installed in their home as part of Mr. Ellis's improvements. They reported the situation to the authorities, who found Mr. Ellis's behavior to be both illegal and invasive. The Thompsons had to undergo extensive repairs to fix the damage and regain their sense of security. 27. The mysterious murals. The Johnson family was excited about their new home in a vibrant neighborhood known for its artistic flair. Their neighbor, Miss Harper, was a well-known muralist who had gained a reputation for her colorful and imaginative artwork. Initially, the Johnsons enjoyed her work, but soon became uneasy as Miss Harper's murals began to take on a disturbing theme. The murals started depicting unsettling and violent scenes that seemed to mirror the Johnsons' private lives. The imagery was both haunting and specific, including eerie representations of family members and personal details. Ms. Harper insisted that the murals were a form of artistic expression and had no malicious intent. The Johnsons felt increasingly uncomfortable and violated by the disturbing murals. They reported Ms. Harper's behavior to local authorities and sought a restraining order to prevent her from using their personal lives as inspiration for her artwork. The situation was resolved after Ms. Harper agreed to alter her artistic focus, but the Johnsons remained wary of their once celebrated neighbor. 28. The nightly intruder. The Parker family had recently moved into a charming home in a sleepy neighborhood, eager to enjoy a peaceful life. Their neighbor, Mr. Stevens, was a friendly but overly inquisitive man who often inquired about their activities. At first, the Parkers didn't think much of it, but they soon began to notice strange occurrences. They found their doors slightly ajar and objects in their home rearranged in odd ways. The final straw came when they discovered that Mr. Stevens had been entering their home during the night, using a spare key he had secretly acquired. He would watch them while they slept and make subtle changes to their home. The Parkers were horrified by the invasion of their privacy and reported Mr. Stevens to the authorities. He was found to have a history of similar behavior with other neighbors and was charged with burglary and invasion of privacy. The Parkers had to make significant changes to their home security to protect themselves from further intrusions. 29. The unsettling rituals. The Brown family enjoyed their new home in a rural area, where they quickly became friends with their neighbor, Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith was known for her involvement in various local community activities. However, things took a dark turn when the Browns started to notice strange activities at Ms. Smith's property. Ms. Smith would often host unusual gatherings that involved odd rituals and ceremonies. The rituals included chanting, the use of strange symbols, and the burning of unusual substances. The Brown family found the activities increasingly disturbing and decided to investigate further. They discovered that Ms. Smith was involved in a secretive religious cult that conducted rituals in an attempt to harness supernatural powers. The Brown family reported the situation to the authorities, who conducted an investigation and found that Ms. Smith's activities were not only unsettling but also involved illegal practices. The Browns had to take extra precautions and eventually moved away to escape the unsettling atmosphere created by their neighbor. 30. The Hidden Room. The Walker family had just moved into a historic home with a fascinating past. Their neighbor, Mr. Johnson, was an amateur historian with an obsessive interest in the property. At first, the Walkers found his enthusiasm charming, but they soon discovered a darker side to his interest. Mr. Johnson had been sneaking into the Walkers' home and had discovered a hidden room in their attic. He had been using this room to conduct unauthorized research and collect personal items from the Walkers. The hidden room was filled with strange artifacts and documents related to the property's history. The Walkers were alarmed by the invasion of their privacy and reported Mr. Johnson's behavior to the authorities. An investigation revealed that Mr. Johnson had a history of similar behavior with other properties. The Walkers had to secure their home and deal with the emotional impact of having their personal space invaded by a neighbor with a disturbing obsession. 31. The Secret Garden. The Carter family had moved into a picturesque home with a beautifully landscaped garden. Their neighbor, Ms. Wallace, was an avid gardener who seemed to take a keen interest in their garden. At first, the Carters welcomed her advice and help, but things soon became uncomfortable. Ms. Wallace began making unauthorized changes to their garden, planting invasive species and rearranging their landscape in ways that seemed excessive and intrusive. She would often show up unannounced, bringing plants and making alterations to their garden without permission. The situation escalated when the Carters discovered that Ms. Wallace had been using the garden as a cover for her own personal agenda. She had been secretly planting rare and dangerous plants that could potentially harm the environment and people. The Carters reported her behavior to the authorities, who found that Ms. Wallace's gardening practices were illegal and dangerous. They had to take measures to restore their garden and ensure it was safe for their family. 32. The Mysterious Package. The Mitchell family had just moved into their new home when they began receiving strange, anonymous packages. The packages contained bizarre and unsettling items, such as old photographs, cryptic notes, and peculiar trinkets. The sender remained unknown, and there were no clear clues about the identity or intentions behind the packages. Their neighbor, Mr. Roberts, was known for his odd behavior and penchant for collecting unusual items. The Mitchells became suspicious when they noticed that Mr. Roberts seemed unusually interested in the packages they received and would often ask about their contents. Eventually, the Mitchells discovered that Mr. Roberts was behind the mysterious packages. He had been sending them as part of a twisted game, trying to unsettle and confuse them. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Roberts was found to have a history of similar behavior. The Mitchells had to take steps to secure their home and deal with the psychological impact of being targeted by their neighbor. 33. The Watchful Eyes. The Lewis family was excited about their new home in a cozy neighborhood. Their neighbor, Ms. Green, was a retired schoolteacher who seemed friendly but had an obsessive interest in their daily lives. She would often watch the Lewis family from her window and comment on their activities. The situation became disturbing when the Lewis family discovered that Ms. Green had installed hidden cameras around their property, including in their backyard and near their windows. She had been using these cameras to monitor their every move and gather personal information. The Lewis family confronted Ms. Green, who claimed she was simply trying to keep an eye on the neighborhood. Her behavior was deemed invasive and illegal, leading to her arrest and the removal of the cameras. The Lewis family had to take extra precautions to ensure their privacy and deal with the emotional distress caused by their neighbor's intrusive actions. 34. The Cursed Lawn. The Evans family moved into a picturesque suburban home, thrilled by the beauty of their new neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Harper, was a retired landscape architect with a peculiar obsession. He believed that certain plants had supernatural properties, His yard was filled with bizarre and exotic plants, some of which had unsettling appearances. The Evans family soon noticed that their lawn was wilting and turning brown, despite their best efforts to maintain it. Mr. Harper would frequently offer unsolicited advice, often suggesting odd and unsettling treatments for their grass. The situation worsened when the Evans found that Mr. Harper had been secretly applying strange substances to their lawn at night. The situation escalated when they discovered that the substances were causing chemical reactions that destroyed their lawn and made the family feel ill. The Evans reported Mr. Harper's actions to the authorities, who found that he had been conducting unauthorized and dangerous experiments. The family had to replace their lawn and take additional measures to ensure their safety. 35. The unseen puppeteer. The Roberts family had recently moved into a charming home with a large, secluded backyard. Their neighbor, Ms. Carter, was a retired puppeteer known for her elaborate performances. At first, the Roberts were intrigued by her craft, but their fascination soon turned to horror. Ms. Carter began performing puppet shows in her backyard at odd hours of the night. The shows were disturbing, featuring dark themes and unsettling characters. The Roberts soon realized that the puppet shows were not just performances, but were meant to convey ominous messages about their family. The situation became more alarming when the Roberts discovered hidden microphones and cameras around their yard, suggesting that Ms. Carter was using the puppet shows to monitor and manipulate them. The authorities were alerted, and Ms. Carter's invasive practices were investigated. The Roberts had to take extensive measures to secure their property and regain their peace of mind. 36. The enigmatic eerie recordings. The Martinez family enjoyed their new home in a quiet neighborhood, but their peace was disturbed by their neighbor, Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell was an eccentric man with a fascination for old technology, particularly reel-to-reel tape recorders. He would often be seen tinkering with his equipment in his garage. The Martinez family began hearing strange, disjointed voices coming through their walls at night. The sounds seemed to be recordings of conversations that the family had had, but with eerie distortions and unsettling background noises. When they investigated, they discovered that Mr. Bell had been using hidden microphones to record their conversations and was playing them back through his old equipment. The recordings were not only disturbing, but also an invasion of privacy. The Martinez family contacted the authorities, who found that Mr. Bell had a history of similar behavior with other neighbors. He was charged with illegal surveillance, and the Martinez family had to take additional steps to secure their privacy. 37. The midnight murmurs. The Adams family was excited to settle into their new home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Their neighbor, Miss Turner, was known for her friendly demeanor, but had a peculiar habit of speaking in hushed, murmuring tones late at night. The family initially thought nothing of it, but the whispers grew louder and more intrusive. The murmurs seemed to be directed at the Adams family, with disturbing references to their personal lives and private conversations. The family decided to investigate and discovered that Miss Turner had been using directional microphones to eavesdrop on their activities and broadcast her murmurs through hidden speakers. The invasion of privacy was alarming, and the Adams family reported Miss Turner's actions to the authorities. An investigation revealed that Miss Turner had been engaging in similar behavior with other neighbors, and she was required to cease her invasive practices. The Adams family had to take additional security measures to ensure their privacy. 38. The Polaroid stalker. The Wilsons were delighted with their new home, but their excitement turned to fear when they began receiving unsettling Polaroid photographs in the mail. The photos showed their family members in various locations around their home, taken from angles that suggested someone had been watching them. Their neighbor, Mr. Wilson, no relation, was a retired photographer with an odd reputation for taking an unusual interest in his neighbors. The Wilsons soon discovered that Mr. Wilson had been taking these photographs from hidden cameras and sending them to unsettle and intimidate the family. The situation was deeply distressing, and the Wilsons reported Mr. Wilson's behavior to the authorities. He was found to have a history of similar behavior with other neighbors and was charged with harassment and invasion of privacy. The Wilsons had to take measures to protect their home and their family's safety. 39. The perpetual darkness. The Clark family enjoyed the serenity of their new rural home until they encountered their neighbor, Ms. Matthews. Ms. Matthews had a peculiar obsession with darkness, keeping her home and yard perpetually shrouded in darkness with heavy blackout curtains and dim outdoor lighting. The Clark family's attempts to enjoy their own yard were thwarted by Ms. Matthews' aggressive use of powerful floodlights that would shine directly into their home, creating a disturbing and disorienting effect. The lights would flicker and change colors, often accompanied by unsettling sounds that added to the eerie atmosphere. The Clarks confronted Ms. Matthews, but she insisted that her lighting choices were meant to create a mood and claimed no intent to disturb her neighbors. The situation escalated, and the authorities were contacted to address the intrusive lighting. The Clarks had to install additional window coverings and adjust their outdoor spaces to regain their sense of peace. 40. The Hidden Lab. The Robinsons moved into a quaint suburban home, only to discover that their neighbor, Dr. Stevens, was running a secret laboratory in his basement. The lab was filled with strange equipment, chemicals, and mysterious substances. Initially, the Robinsons noticed peculiar odors and strange noises coming from Dr. Stevens' property. The situation became alarming when the Robinsons realized that Dr. Stevens was conducting unethical and dangerous experiments, including the manipulation of hazardous chemicals and biological agents. The experiments were not only a safety hazard, but also a severe invasion of privacy, as Dr. Stevens' activities began to affect the Robinsons' health and well-being. The Robinsons reported the situation to the authorities, who conducted a thorough investigation and shut down the illegal lab. Dr. Stevens faced charges related to hazardous material handling and public safety violations. The Robinsons had to undergo health screenings and take steps to ensure their home was free from contamination. 41. The constant surveillance. The Harris family had recently moved into a cozy home in a friendly neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, seemed like a pleasant retired man who enjoyed gardening. However, things took a disturbing turn when the Harris family realized that Mr. Jenkins had an obsession with monitoring their activities. Mr. Jenkins had installed an extensive network of surveillance cameras and motion sensors around the Harris property, including in areas that were meant to be private. He would frequently make comments about their activities and daily routines, revealing an alarming level of detail. When confronted, Mr. Jenkins admitted that he was monitoring the family out of a misplaced sense of security and concern. His behavior was deemed invasive and illegal, leading to a police investigation and the removal of the surveillance equipment. The Harris family had to take additional measures to restore their sense of privacy and security. 42. The unsettling broadcasts. The Martin family was excited about their new home in a quiet neighborhood. Their neighbor, Ms. Blackwell, was a former radio technician who had set up a home radio station. Initially, the broadcasts seemed harmless, but the content soon became disturbing. Ms. Blackwell began broadcasting unsettling messages and strange sounds directed at the Martin family. The broadcasts included eerie messages that referenced private details about their lives and included disturbing sound effects meant to unsettle them. The Martins decided to investigate and discovered that Ms. Blackwell had been using her radio station to harass and intimidate them. They reported the situation to the authorities, who found that Ms. Blackwell's broadcasts violated privacy laws and constituted harassment. The Martin family had to take steps to block the broadcasts and address the psychological impact of the harassment. 43. The obsessive pet sitter. The Green family was delighted to adopt a friendly golden retriever named Max. Their neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, offered to help with pet sitting whenever they went on vacation. At first, the Green family appreciated her willingness to help, but they soon noticed unsettling behavior. Mrs. Johnson began spending excessive amounts of time at their home, taking Max for walks at odd hours and bringing him unusual treats. She seemed overly attached to Max, and the Green family started receiving strange updates and photos of their dog in bizarre outfits and situations. The situation became alarming when the Greens discovered that Mrs. Johnson had been secretly entering their home to spend time with Max, often rearranging their belongings and leaving unsettling notes. The family confronted her and found that she had an unhealthy obsession with their dog. They had to restrict access and take legal action to prevent further intrusions. 44. The mystery garden gnome. The Mitchell family was settling into their new home when they noticed a peculiar garden gnome appearing in their yard overnight. The gnome was placed in different spots each morning, always with an unsettling expression and sometimes accompanied by cryptic messages. Their neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was known for his eccentricities and had a collection of garden gnomes that he proudly displayed. The Mitchells initially thought the gnome was a prank, but became increasingly disturbed when they discovered that it was accompanied by a hidden camera. The Mitchells found out that Mr. Thompson had been using the gnome to spy on them and record their activities. They reported his behavior to the authorities, who investigated and found that Mr. Thompson had a history of similar behavior. The Mitchells had to take precautions to secure their privacy and address the psychological impact of being watched. 45. The enigmatic noise complaints. The Foster family moved into a peaceful neighborhood, only to find themselves plagued by constant noise complaints from their neighbor, Ms. Davis. Ms. Davis would frequently report minor noises, claiming they were disturbing her peace. Despite the Foster family's efforts to address the complaints, the situation escalated when they discovered that Ms. Davis was using the complaints as a cover for her own disturbing activities. She had installed audio recording devices around their home and was fabricating complaints to create a false sense of disturbance. The Foster family realized that Ms. Davis was using the noise complaints to justify her invasive behavior. They reported her actions to the authorities, who found that her behavior was both deceptive and intrusive. The Foster family had to take steps to protect their privacy and manage the psychological impact of being targeted by their neighbor. 46. The vanishing items. The Clark family had recently moved into a charming home with a large attic. They enjoyed the space until they started noticing items disappearing from their home. Initially, they thought it was due to misplacement, but the problem persisted and grew more alarming. Their neighbor, Mrs. Wright, was a retired librarian who frequently visited them and seemed overly interested in their home. The Clarks discovered that Mrs. Wright had been entering their home when they were away and taking items from their attic, believing they were valuable or meaningful. The situation became distressing when Mrs. Wright's actions were uncovered. She had been cataloging the items and using them for her own purposes, including displaying them in her home. The Clarks had to secure their home and address the invasion of their privacy with legal action. 47. The haunting in the basement. The Young family had recently purchased an old Victorian home with a spacious basement. They were excited about the new space, but soon became unsettled by their neighbor, Mr. Keller, who frequently asked about the basement and its use. The Youngs discovered that Mr. Keller had been sneaking into their basement and conducting strange rituals involving eerie symbols and unsettling artifacts. He claimed that he was trying to cleanse the space, but his activities were both invasive and disturbing. The Youngs reported Mr. Keller's behavior to the authorities, who found that his rituals involved dangerous practices and violated local laws. The family had to undergo extensive cleanup and take measures to ensure their home was safe and free from further disturbances. 48. The creepy surveillance network. The Anderson family moved into a new neighborhood and quickly became aware of their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had a reputation for being overly involved in community matters. They initially dismissed her behavior, but soon became concerned when they noticed strange occurrences. The Andersons discovered that Mrs. Thompson had set up an elaborate network of surveillance cameras around their property, including in areas that were meant to be private. She had been monitoring their activities and gathering personal information under the guise of being a concerned neighbor. The situation was deeply unsettling, and the Andersons reported Mrs. Thompson's actions to the authorities. An investigation revealed that her surveillance network was both illegal and invasive. The Andersons had to take steps to secure their home and address the psychological impact of being watched. 49. The perpetual party. The Stevens family enjoyed their new home, but their peace was disrupted by their neighbor, Mr. Clark, who frequently hosted loud and raucous parties. The parties often lasted late into the night, and despite numerous complaints, Mr. Clark showed no signs of moderation. The Stevens family soon realized that the parties were not just social gatherings, but were being used as a cover for Mr. Clark's disturbing behavior. He would use the parties to attract attention away from his illegal activities, including hosting unregulated and unsafe gatherings that endangered other neighbors. The Stevens reported Mr. Clark's activities to the authorities, who investigated and found that his parties were in violation of several local laws and safety regulations. The situation was resolved after Mr. Clark was required to cease his disruptive behavior, but the Stevens had to take measures to recover from the disturbances caused by their neighbor. 50. The Eerie Book Club. The Wright family moved into a cozy home and became acquainted with their neighbor, Mrs. Green, who ran a local book club. The book club seemed like a harmless social activity, but the Wrights soon found that it had a sinister side. Mrs. Green's book club meetings involved reading and discussing disturbing and dark literature that seemed to reflect the Wrights' personal lives and fears. The club members would often discuss unsettling topics and use the discussions to subtly intimidate and unsettle the Wright family. The Wrights discovered that Mrs. Green was using the book club as a means to gather personal information and manipulate them psychologically. They reported the situation to the authorities, who found that the book club activities were both invasive and disturbing. The Wrights had to distance themselves from the book club and address the psychological impact of being targeted by their neighbor. 51. The Deceptive Gardener. The Barnes family was thrilled to move into their new home with a beautifully landscaped garden. Their neighbor, Mr. Rogers, was a retired horticulturist who took an avid interest in gardening. At first, the Barnes appreciated his advice and help with their garden. However, Mr. Rogers began making invasive changes to their garden, insisting that his expertise required him to correct certain aspects. He planted invasive species and altered their garden's layout in ways that caused significant damage. The situation turned sinister when the Barnes discovered that Mr. Rogers was using the garden to hide cameras and listening devices. He had been monitoring their private conversations and activities under the guise of gardening. The Barnes reported his actions to the authorities, who found that his behavior was both invasive and illegal. They had to restore their garden and take steps to protect their privacy. 52. The Secret Passage. The Lee family had recently purchased a historic home with a charming old-world feel. Their neighbor, Mrs. Mitchell, was an amateur historian with a fascination for local architecture. She often visited the Lee family under the pretense of offering historical insights. The Lee family discovered a hidden passage in their home that led to a concealed room. To their horror, they found out that Mrs. Mitchell had been using the passage to enter their home without their knowledge. She had been accessing their belongings and gathering personal information. The Lee family confronted Mrs. Mitchell and found that she had a history of similar behavior with other properties. The authorities were involved, and Mrs. Mitchell was charged with trespassing and invasion of privacy. The Lees had to secure their home and address the unsettling breach of their personal space. 53. The Suspicious Package. The Thompson family had just moved into their new home when they began receiving strange packages at their doorstep. The packages contained odd and disturbing items such as dismembered dolls, cryptic notes, and unsettling photographs. Their neighbor, Mr. Brown, seemed overly interested in the packages and would often inquire about them. The Thompson family grew suspicious and decided to investigate further. They discovered that Mr. Brown was sending the packages as part of a twisted game to unsettle and intimidate them. The authorities were notified, and Mr. Brown was found to have a history of similar behavior. He was charged with harassment and the illegal sending of disturbing materials. The Thompson family had to take additional measures to secure their home and deal with the emotional impact of being targeted. 54. The Strange Charitable Donations. The Robinson family was excited to start their new life in a peaceful neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mrs. Baker, was known for her charitable efforts and often encouraged the Robinsons to donate to various causes. At first, the Robinsons were happy to participate. However, Mrs. Baker's requests for donations became increasingly aggressive and invasive. She would show up unannounced, pressuring the Robinsons for larger and more frequent contributions. The situation took a dark turn when the Robinsons discovered that Mrs. Baker was using the donations to fund illegal activities and exploit vulnerable individuals. The Robinsons reported Mrs. Baker's behavior to the authorities, who found that her charitable efforts were a front for criminal activities. Mrs. Baker faced legal consequences, and the Robinsons had to take steps to protect themselves from further exploitation. 55. The Nighttime Caller. The Evans family was settling into their new home when they began receiving disturbing phone calls late at night. The calls were from an unknown number and included eerie and threatening messages. The calls became more frequent and unsettling, causing the family great distress. Their neighbor, Mr. Harris, was a reclusive man known for his odd behavior and love of technology. The Evans family discovered that Mr. Harris had been using sophisticated technology to disguise his phone number and make the calls. He had been harassing the family under the cover of anonymity. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Harris was found to be responsible for the harassing calls. He was charged with stalking and harassment. The Evans family had to take extra precautions to protect their privacy and deal with the emotional trauma caused by their neighbor. 56. The Airy Nursery. The Wilson family had just welcomed a new baby and was excited to set up the nursery in their new home. Their neighbor, Ms. Allen, was a retired school teacher who frequently offered advice on baby care and nursery design. The Wilsons were initially grateful for her help, but became concerned when they noticed unsettling changes in the nursery. Ms. Allen had been entering their home without permission and making alterations to the nursery, including placing disturbing items and changing the decor to unsettling themes. The Wilsons discovered that Ms. Allen had a fascination with the macabre and had been using the nursery as part of her obsession. They reported her behavior to the authorities, who found that Ms. Allen's actions were both invasive and disturbing. The Wilsons had to remove the unsettling items and ensure their home was secure. 57. The Disappearing Pets. The Clark family had recently moved into a new home with a large backyard. Their neighbor, Mr. Wilson, was known for his love of animals and often offered to help care for their pets. The Clarks trusted him until they began to notice their pets disappearing. The situation became alarming when they discovered that Mr. Wilson had been taking their pets and keeping them in poor conditions. He had been using their pets for his own purposes, including experimentation and unethical practices. The Clarks reported Mr. Wilson's actions to the authorities, who found that his behavior was both cruel and illegal. Mr. Wilson faced charges related to animal cruelty, and the Clarks had to take measures to protect their remaining pets and ensure their safety. 58. The Airy Soundtrack. The Martin family enjoyed their new home and the quiet neighborhood, but their peace was disrupted by their neighbor, Ms. Thompson, who was a former musician. Ms. Thompson frequently played music at odd hours, which became increasingly unsettling. The Martin family discovered that Ms. Thompson was using the music to broadcast disturbing and eerie sounds that seemed to invade their home. The soundtrack included unsettling noises and distorted messages that created a disturbing atmosphere. The Martin family investigated and found that Ms. Thompson was using the music to harass and unsettle them. They reported her actions to the authorities, who found that her behavior was both invasive and illegal. The Martin family had to take steps to block the disturbing sounds and restore their sense of peace. 59. The Obsessive Housekeeper. The Adams family had recently moved into a beautiful home with a charming garden. Their neighbor, Mrs. Williams, offered to help with house cleaning and gardening, which the Adams family initially accepted. However, Mrs. Williams's help became increasingly intrusive. She would often clean areas of the home that the Adams family had not asked her to, and she began making changes to their garden without permission. The situation turned alarming when the Adams family discovered that Mrs. Williams was using her access to their home to spy on them and gather personal information. The Adams family reported Mrs. Williams's behavior to the authorities, who found that her actions were both invasive and illegal. Mrs. Williams faced legal consequences, and the Adams family had to take steps to ensure their privacy and security. 60. The Hidden Messages. The Baker family had just moved into their new home when they began receiving mysterious notes slipped under their door. The notes contained cryptic messages and disturbing references to their personal lives. The family became increasingly worried about the source of the notes. Their neighbor, Mr. Lewis, was known for his eccentric behavior and interest in local folklore. The Baker family discovered that Mr. Lewis had been leaving the notes as part of a twisted game, trying to unsettle and frighten them with references to local legends and personal details. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Lewis was found to be responsible for the disturbing messages. He faced charges related to harassment and invasion of privacy. The Baker family had to take additional steps to secure their home and address the emotional impact of being targeted. 61. The Accusatory Paintings. The Turner family moved into a charming old house, eager to start fresh. Their neighbor, Mrs. Palmer, was an artist known for her striking paintings. The Turners were initially intrigued by her work, but soon found themselves disturbed by her actions. Mrs. Palmer began painting unsettling portraits of the Turner family, depicting them in distressing and ominous scenarios. The paintings, which included eerie symbols and dark themes, started appearing on their property, including on their porch and windows. The Turners discovered that Mrs. Palmer had been using the paintings to express her own twisted interpretations of their lives and create a sense of dread. They reported her actions to the authorities, who found that her behavior was invasive and disturbing. The Turners had to take steps to protect their home from further intrusion. 62. The spooky rituals. The Davis family had just moved into a large, secluded house when they began noticing strange occurrences in their yard. Their neighbor, Mr. Reed, was a reclusive individual known for his unusual habits and interest in ancient rituals. The family discovered that Mr. Reed was performing disturbing rituals in their yard at night, involving strange symbols and chanting. The rituals were meant to create a sense of fear and disturbance, and the Davis family began finding unsettling symbols and artifacts around their property. When confronted, Mr. Reed claimed that the rituals were meant to protect the neighborhood, but his actions were clearly invasive and alarming. The authorities investigated and found that Mr. Reed's activities were a violation of local laws. The Davis family had to take measures to secure their property and restore their peace. 63. The creepy puzzles. The Lewis family was excited to start their new life in a peaceful neighborhood. Their neighbor, Ms. Brooks, was a retired puzzle designer who often created intricate and challenging puzzles. Initially, the Lewis family enjoyed her work, but things soon took a disturbing turn. Ms. Brooks began leaving unsettling puzzles on the Lewis family's doorstep, each one featuring disturbing images and cryptic messages. The puzzles seemed to reference personal details about the family's lives and included dark themes that created a sense of unease. The Lewis family investigated and discovered that Ms. Brooks was using the puzzles to invade their privacy and unsettle them. They reported her behavior to the authorities, who found that her actions were both intrusive and disturbing. The Lewis family had to take steps to protect their privacy and manage the psychological impact of the unsettling puzzles. 64. The unnerving social media posts. The Carter family had recently moved into their new home and were adjusting to their new neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Fisher, was known for his social media presence and often shared updates about the community. The Carters noticed that Mr. Fisher began posting disturbing and invasive content about their family on his social media accounts. The posts included private details about their lives, manipulated images, and unsettling commentary that created a sense of fear and invasion. The Carters confronted Mr. Fisher and discovered that he was using social media to harass and intimidate them. They reported his actions to the platform and the authorities, who found that his behavior was illegal and constituted harassment. The Carters had to take measures to protect their privacy and address the emotional impact of the situation. 65. The darkened windows. The Martinez family was thrilled to move into their new home, but their neighbor, Ms. Sullivan, quickly became a source of concern. Ms. Sullivan was known for her strict routines and peculiar behavior, including keeping her windows heavily covered with dark curtains. The Martinez family began noticing that Ms. Sullivan's windows would be opened slightly at odd hours, allowing glimpses of unsettling activity inside her home. They saw strange, shadowy figures moving and heard unsettling noises emanating from her house. When they investigated further, they discovered that Ms. Sullivan had been using her home for disturbing activities, including setting up elaborate displays and creating unsettling atmospheres. The Martinez family reported her behavior to the authorities, who found that Ms. Sullivan's activities were disturbing but not illegal. The family had to take steps to shield their own home from the unsettling view. 66. The sinister time capsule. The Walker family was excited to find an old time capsule buried in their yard, which they assumed was a fun relic of the past. However, their neighbor, Mr. Thompson, showed an unusual interest in the capsule and its contents. After opening the capsule, the Walkers found disturbing items, including old photographs, unsettling messages, and cryptic objects. They discovered that Mr. Thompson had buried the capsule on their property as part of a twisted game to unsettle and intimidate them. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Thompson was found to have a history of similar behavior with other neighbors. He faced charges related to harassment and invasion of privacy. The Walkers had to deal with the psychological impact of being targeted and take steps to secure their property. 67. The creepy book borrower. The Johnson family had just settled into their new home and enjoyed spending time in their cozy library. Their neighbor, Ms. Gray, was an avid reader and frequently borrowed books from them, which the Johnsons were happy to lend. However, Ms. Gray's requests for books became increasingly peculiar, and she would often return them with disturbing notes and unsettling changes. The Johnsons discovered that Ms. Gray had been using their books to gather information about their personal lives and create disturbing narratives. When confronted, Ms. Gray admitted to using the books to manipulate and unsettle the Johnsons. She was reported to the authorities, who found her behavior invasive and alarming. The Johnsons had to take measures to protect their privacy and restore their peace of mind. 68. The hidden alarm system. The Thompson family was pleased with their new home, but their neighbor, Mr. Walker, began showing an unusual interest in their security system. He frequently asked about their alarm system and offered unsolicited advice. The Thompsons discovered that Mr. Walker had secretly installed additional alarms and surveillance devices around their home, creating an invasive and overwhelming monitoring system. He was using the system to watch and control their activities without their consent. The Thompsons reported Mr. Walker's actions to the authorities, who found that his behavior was both illegal and disturbing. He faced charges related to unauthorized surveillance and invasion of privacy. The Thompsons had to remove the invasive devices and take steps to secure their home. 69. The persistent visitor. The Green family enjoyed their new home, but quickly became unsettled by their neighbor, Mrs. Edwards, who would frequently visit them under the guise of being friendly and helpful. Despite polite refusals, Mrs. Edwards continued to show up at their door unannounced. The Green family discovered that Mrs. Edwards was using her frequent visits to gather personal information and subtly manipulate their lives. She would make strange comments and ask probing questions, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. The Green family reported Mrs. Edwards to the authorities, who found that her behavior was intrusive and constituted harassment. Mrs. Edwards was warned to cease her actions, and the Green family had to take measures to protect their privacy and avoid further disturbances. 70. The secret room. The Roberts family had recently moved into a large old home and were excited to explore its unique features. They discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in their basement. The room was filled with old furniture, strange artifacts, and disturbing writings. Their neighbor, Mr. Harris, seemed overly interested in the room and began visiting them frequently, offering unsolicited advice and making odd comments about the room's contents. The Roberts discovered that Mr. Harris had been secretly accessing the room and using it for disturbing purposes, including creating unsettling displays and gathering personal information. The Roberts reported Mr. Harris's actions to the authorities, who found his behavior to be both illegal and disturbing. He faced charges related to unauthorized entry and invasion of privacy. The Roberts had to secure their home and address the psychological impact of the intrusion. 71. The eerie paintings. The Nelson family was thrilled to move into their new home and enjoyed the quiet neighborhood. Their neighbor, Mr. Walters, was an amateur painter who often displayed his work in his front yard. Initially, the Nelsons admired his creativity. However, Mr. Walters' paintings took a dark turn. He started depicting disturbing and surreal scenes that seemed to mirror the Nelsons' private lives. The paintings included unsettling images and bizarre symbols that made the family uneasy. The Nelsons soon discovered that Mr. Walters was using his paintings to express his twisted fascination with their lives and create a sense of dread. They reported his actions to the authorities, who found that his behavior was both invasive and disturbing. The family had to take steps to protect their privacy and deal with the emotional impact of the situation. 72. The chilling rituals. The Harris family was excited about their new home, but their neighbor, Mrs. Collins, was known for her eccentric and secretive behavior. The Harris family noticed strange occurrences in their yard, including odd symbols and rituals performed at night. Mrs. Collins was discovered to be conducting disturbing rituals on the Harris property involving strange ceremonies and dark practices. The rituals were intended to create a sense of fear and manipulate the Harris family psychologically. The authorities investigated and found that Mrs. Collins' actions were both illegal and unsettling. She faced charges related to disturbing the peace and invasion of privacy. The Harris family had to secure their property and address the psychological impact of the rituals. 73. The mysterious outsider. The Scott family enjoyed their new home, but became increasingly disturbed by their neighbor, Mr. King, who would often appear at odd hours, peering into their windows and making unsettling comments. The Scott family discovered that Mr. King had been using his outsider status to spy on them and gather personal information. He would often leave disturbing notes and creepy gifts on their doorstep, creating an atmosphere of fear. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. King was found to be responsible for the harassment and invasion of privacy. He faced legal consequences, and the Scott family had to take measures to protect their home and deal with the psychological impact of being targeted. 74. The intrusive renovations. The Ramirez family was excited to renovate their new home, but their neighbor, Mr. Douglas, became overly involved in their renovation plans. He frequently offered unsolicited advice and made changes to their renovation work without permission. The situation turned disturbing when the Ramirezes discovered that Mr. Douglas had been using the renovations as an opportunity to install hidden surveillance equipment and intrude on their privacy. He was gathering personal information and creating a sense of constant surveillance. The Ramirezes reported Mr. Douglas's actions to the authorities, who found that his behavior was both invasive and illegal. He faced charges related to unauthorized surveillance and invasion of privacy. The family had to remove the hidden equipment and secure their home. 75. The sinister mailman. The Williams family had recently moved into a quiet neighborhood and was pleased with their new home. However, their mailman, Mr. Brooks, began showing an unusual interest in their mail and would often make strange comments about their correspondence. The Williams family discovered that Mr. Brooks had been tampering with their mail, intercepting sensitive information and using it to harass and intimidate them. He would send disturbing letters and packages, creating a sense of fear and invasion. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Brooks was found to be responsible for the mail tampering and harassment. He faced charges related to postal crimes and invasion of privacy. The Williams family had to take measures to secure their mail and address the emotional impact of the situation. 76. The disturbing donations. The Foster family enjoyed their new home, but was troubled by their neighbor, Ms. Reed, who frequently visited and offered donations of unusual and disturbing items. The donations included bizarre artifacts, unsettling decorations, and cryptic messages. The Foster family discovered that Ms. Reed was using the donations as a way to manipulate and unsettle them. She would often use the items to create a sense of fear and invasion, making the family feel constantly watched and threatened. The authorities were contacted, and Ms. Reed faced charges related to harassment and manipulation. The Foster family had to take steps to protect their privacy and deal with the psychological impact of the unsettling donations. 77. The mysterious tapes. The Thompson family moved into a charming old house and began noticing mysterious tapes being left on their doorstep. The tapes contained disturbing footage of their home and personal lives, often showing private moments and unsettling scenes. Their neighbor, Mr. Green, was known for his interest in film and video editing. The Thompsons discovered that Mr. Green was using the tapes to spy on them and create a sense of fear and invasion. He had been recording and editing footage to manipulate and unsettle the family. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Green was found to be responsible for the disturbing tapes and invasion of privacy. He faced charges related to unauthorized surveillance and harassment. The Thompson family had to take measures to secure their home and address the emotional impact of the situation. 78. The unsettling garden gnomes. The Miller family enjoyed their garden but became disturbed when they started finding unusual garden gnomes placed in their yard. The gnomes had eerie expressions and unsettling accessories, including strange symbols and cryptic messages. Their neighbor, Mrs. Adams, was known for her love of garden gnomes and frequently added new ones to her collection. The Millers discovered that Mrs. Adams was using the gnomes to create a sense of fear and intrusion, placing them in locations that made the family feel constantly watched. The authorities were contacted, and Mrs. Adams faced charges related to harassment and invasion of privacy. The Miller family had to remove the unsettling gnomes and take steps to protect their privacy. 79. The hidden cameras. The Johnson family was excited about their new home, but became alarmed when they discovered hidden cameras installed throughout their property. The cameras were placed in private areas, including bedrooms and bathrooms, creating a severe invasion of privacy. Their neighbor, Mr. Hill, was known for his interest in technology and surveillance equipment. The Johnsons discovered that Mr. Hill had installed the cameras to monitor and record their private moments, creating a constant sense of fear and violation. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. Hill faced charges related to illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy. The Johnson family had to remove the hidden cameras and take steps to secure their home from further intrusion. 80. The intrusive renovator. The Lee family had recently purchased an old home and were excited to begin renovations. Their neighbor, Mr. White, began offering unsolicited advice and frequently visited during the renovation process. The Lees discovered that Mr. White was using his visits to make unauthorized changes to their home and gather personal information. He had installed hidden compartments and surveillance equipment under the guise of helping with renovations. The authorities were contacted, and Mr. White faced charges related to unauthorized alterations and invasion of privacy. The Lees had to address the changes made to their home and take measures to protect their privacy.